Basically, I've always enjoyed playing with words, and I've gotten involved in the climate controversies and issues for the past decade or so, and thought I'd marry the two together and have some fun in a very unfun subject, climate change, by attempting to both create new words, but also to explain existing terms, hopefully in a way that people can understand. And the book is really a combination of both of them. It's called A Climate Vocabulary of the Future, and it's all proceeds will go to climate charities.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to another Climate Emergency Forum. My name is Regina Valdez, and I am your host. Today, we are going to discuss a new climate vocabulary. Well, listen, if we have a new climate, we might as well have a new vocabulary in which to discuss it. And we have none other than Mr. Herb Simmons, who wrote the book himself on the new climate vocabulary to discuss this topic. Herb Simmons, he's been a path breaker a lot of his life. He was the youngest county administrator in the county of Atlantic County, New Jersey, when casinos were legalized in Atlantic City. He's also an award-winning creator of New Jersey's long-range Smart Growth Master Plan in 2000 as executive director of New Jersey's State Planning Commission and the leader of one of the first consortiums of higher education institutions to fight climate change in the early 2000s. And that's what we need. We need new education. We need a new focus on youth, climate. And in order to do that, we need a new vocabulary. Listen, one of the things that when I first started getting in this climate education that we're so focused on here at the forum, one of the things I noticed is the vocabulary. If you're new to this, there are just so many words that you really need to know if you want to have an understanding of the science, have an understanding of what's going on, and be able to speak to others in a way that you can be understood and they can understand you. And we do have a glossary that's been put together there, so please check it out at climateemergencyforum.org. If you see anything that's missing that we can add, please let us know in the comments below. As you know, we always love to hear your thoughts. We love our interactive audience, so please let us know your thoughts. And without further ado, I'm going to pass it on to Herb. So Herb, please tell us a little bit about your book.
Thanks so much, Regina. Basically, I've always enjoyed playing with words, and I've gotten involved in the climate controversies and issues for the past decade or so, and thought I'd marry the two together and have some fun in a very unfun subject, climate change, by attempting to both create new words, but also to explain existing terms, hopefully in a way that people can understand. And the book is really a combination of both of them. It's called A Climate Vocabulary of the Future, and it's all proceeds will go to climate charities. So I encourage you to take a look at it. You know, if I were retitling it today, I might call it a bioclimate vocabulary of the future, because we're really talking about a biodiversity and ecological crisis as much as we are a climate crisis, and they overlap and intersect in all kinds of ways. But because climate affects everything and is affected by everything, the book tries to, and hopefully it succeeds, at dealing with climate psychology and climate economics and climate politics, as well as the science and the technology and the psychology of it and all the rest of that. But in addition, if it was just a series of words and terms, it might be a little dry, even though I've tried to leaven it up with some humor here or there. The reader will determine whether he or she finds it humorous. But I also thought that one of the ways that people learn about anything, but particularly climate, is through stories. And so I wrote 10,000 or 5,000 word, felt like 10,000, 5,000 word vision looking back from 2035, incorporating many of these terms. And I'm going to read the tiniest excerpt of that because we don't have much time, as well as now I'm going to highlight a few of the terms that I particularly enjoy. There are 1,000 overall, so don't worry, I will only be mentioning a handful of them, but let me just mention some. Though before I do, part of the other issue is that so many of the terms that are currently used are so dense and stuffy and incomprehensible. Mitigation, negative emissions, anthropocentric, and barely pronounce them, intended nationally determined contributions, and many, many more. Nobody knows about them. Nobody understands them except the specialized few, but you can't fight the climate crisis with a specialized few. So anyway, here are some terms. Global stilling. I don't have time to define them, but I sort of throw them out. Comfort rationing, the earth print, a carbonoscopy, hyper feedbacks and hyper cascades, punctuated disequilibrium, macrosilience, the media omerta or code of silence, guilt per gallon, micro mitigation, the nutrisphere and the morphosphere representing the shape of things and nutrition, pagency, the need for both patience and urgency, the petrostate predicament. The petrostates make their money from oil, and yet they need to find a way to get off of that. A planetary trusteeship, polygration, to recognize the fact that migration is occurring all over the place, readaptation, because it's not one and done where you adapt and then stop. You're continually adapting. Rebuildables in addition to renewables, because they're not permanent. Climalateralism, like multilateralism, the need to negotiate between groups and between groups, and time migration, that we need to shift our times to stick with the weather. And very briefly, just a couple of quick excerpts from the vision there. The ERA, or emission reductions alone strategy, pursued for 30 years in a tragically unsuccessful way, was finally abandoned by the Climate Commissariat in 2025. A new strategy, the climate triad, pool, reduce, and remove, was embraced by countries. Let's look back at the past decade. The cryosphere, particularly in the Arctic, and I owe a lot of this to you, Paul, the cryosphere, particularly in the Arctic, all but disappeared as tundra turmoil, permadeath, drunken trees, methane craters, and zombie bacteria reshaped what is now known as the Great Lost North. The dreaded Arctic Blue Ocean event dramatically accelerated global heating. The loss of ocean nutrients became so acute that the omega-3 oils, they're now called the omega-2 oils. Even the sonosphere, the sounds around us, changed as increasing biophonic discord took over. This was truly an era of tearful triage. But moving towards a more positive vision, climate justice emerged as a central organizing principle. Intergenerational equity was recognized with the establishment of climate trustees for the future in many governments there. And then moving still further toward at 2035 to basically cooling technology, we have 5 billion people watched as the first SIVs, stratospheric injection vehicles, released their sulfur payloads high in the sky. Celebrations, incantations, and demonstrations brought people together for the first time in decades. On the split screen, one also saw sleek sea vessels with slim snouts, meticulously crafted to deliver designer salts to brighten marine clouds as the vessels tacked through open waters on their way to dampen a potential hurricane or help save an endangered coral reef. On land, mirrors were carefully deployed by the millions, transforming the climate. And as of New Year's Eve, 2035, the triad-based restoration movement was proving that it could succeed in achieving the unthinkable this century, restoring a healthy climate. To celebrate the success, revelers in 450 cities celebrated by cheering on as 450 carbon concentration clocks showed the first decline in CO2 concentrations since the Industrial Revolution, from, you guessed it, 451 to 450 parts per million. Restoration inspired billions to turn from social media, Kim Kardashian, fast fashion, drug despair, enervating climate battles, and false fascist allures to the most exciting challenge of all, rebuilding a thriving, healthy planet by meeting the one generation climate challenge. So let me stop there.
Wow, you said an awful lot. That's quite a lot to digest. I really enjoyed some of those climate words and concepts and phrases that you brought up. I know that you were inspired a lot by Paul, so I want to just like jet right over to Paul and hear his response to what you just shared with us.
Thank you. Thanks a lot, Herb. I think it's very important to do what you're doing, which is painting stories of the near-term future. I mean, you picked sort of 2035 because people really need to understand a bit about some of the things that might be going on in the near-term future to try to fight climate change, because it's definitely worsened a lot. We're getting acceleration of global heating. We've already we're looking at the 1.5 in the rearview mirror essentially, and we'll be looking at 2, in the next decade or slightly more. So how do you get to people about what's happening with the climate? Well, people, of course, love and evolved around stories and storytelling. And, storytelling is done with words. And, words are very, very important component of stories. And obviously, with all of the new things happening with climate, our vocabulary is not really sufficient, or there's lots of gaps. There's lots of places where we can add to words and phrases to bring meaning to what we need to do to address climate change. So also people have said words are like arrows, right? They can be very, very important. And I think the objective of painting dire pictures, or I should say realistic pictures of where we're heading, because when you head somewhere and you don't change, then you eventually reach where you're heading, and that's where it is. And it's going to be a much warmer world, a world that's much less able to support humans. And the biggest concern, of course, is the global food supply. Our goal, I guess, is to tell people this is like the future where we're heading. What can we do? We need social tipping points, which is another term that you've used and I've often used it to get change that's needed to address the problem. So some of the terms, I also like playing with words. I read an awful lot. And some of the phrases I brought to the climate fight is Arctic temperature amplification. I started using that phrase, I think, before most people started using it. Arctic amplification, the idea that the poles are warming much faster, the north, but it's also polar temperature amplification. The Arctic Blue Ocean event, where, instead of that white ocean coverage of ice, we have, just open water, blue ocean. So, that's the phrase that's caught on. The terms global weirding, global wilding, global whiplashing, weather wilding, weather whiplashing are all terms that I used many, many years ago. And I think there's actually some scientific papers, one by Jennifer Francis in particular in the last few years, and a new one on weather whiplashing studies. Another phrase, one of my favorites, I was giving an interview for CTV News when I was doing some volunteer work for Sierra Club Canada. Probably, I think it was about 2010 or something. And I came up with the phrase during the live interview, what happens in the Arctic doesn't stay in the Arctic. It's not like Las Vegas. So this is the idea that the Arctic change the jet streams, which then influence climate and extreme weather patterns around the entire planet. A term that I use, which wasn't very popular, and it goes back to about that same time as the Sierra Club work, was anthropogenic Arctic volcano. The idea, that we can simulate what's done in a volcano to cool the planet. This is the sulfur injections in the upper atmosphere, or sulfur dioxide injections. They also talk about the solutions being a three-legged bar stool, like you call it the triad, but basically we need to slash fossil fuels, we need carbon dioxide removal scaled up and done and working, and we need SRM, or solar radiation management, to buy us time. And all of these things are, of course, are very, very, controversial concepts, the SRM especially. So I sign off on most of my videos. I ask people to support my work in abrupt climate system mayhem. So the idea of abrupt climate change, that term's been around for a long time, but I think it's very important that, people realize how quickly climate is accelerating. So thank you very much for your wonderful book. And if I can ask you, what your plans are. I'm sure you're not stopping here. So what do you have your next book well underway, or what are your plans? And also, are you going on a lot of book tours around the US, like and other places? Are you going on Zoom calls with groups, people asking about your book? Because if people aren't reading it, then it's a problem. We got to get it out to as many people as possible, and hopefully this video will help in that. But what else are you doing to promote your book to getting wider readership? I mean, your website is actually quite good. Lots of good quotes. You've got lots of people like McGibbon and lots of other well-known people in the climate field commenting on how great your book is. So that's also very, very helpful. So I use too many words myself often. So let's go back to some of the words from you.
Well, thank you so much, Paul. I have been giving some talks and hope to do more in the coming future. And if any of those who are watching this video would feel there'd be some benefit in having me speak with your group, please get in touch with me. Either at a very simple email address, climatevocabulary@gmail.com, or at my own H. Simmons, Herb Simmons, H. Simmons @gmail.com. Be happy to do that. And actually, you've had on and you've worked with a lot of the people that I work with, and the sort of the other climate hat I wear, which is involved in the Healthy Planet Action Coalition that I co-founded. And we work with all sorts of people from around the world on developing approaches and publicizing them that does cool the planet. The term I came up with that we use is direct climate cooling. There are about a dozen different synonyms for geoengineering, solar radiation management, sunlight reflection, as you all know. So I spend a lot of my time working with HPAC, and I welcome people to Google HPAC and join with us. We're about 200 people strong, and we'd love to get you to speak with us, Paul, one day in the near future, because we really have a very interested and sophisticated audience involved. So those are a couple of things I'm doing. I'm also, interestingly, this is sort of a little bit of tangent, but it's maybe slightly related to climate. I've become very fascinated with the critical role that's underappreciated of light, everyday light in healing a human illness and keeping people well. And so I'm writing a paper that may turn out to be a book on that subject, and to figure out how that interacts with climate change. But I'll stop there.
Well, thank you so much. I love the idea of the international, did you say international, Herb, healing?
Yeah, I mean, basically the idea of light being able to help deal with virtually every illness, preventing and curing. I mean, it's not an absolute cure-all, but it's in our sort of pharmaceuticalized Western world, we go to a patent drug rather than to natural solutions. And I think there is an important analogy with the climate crisis and how we address that as well.
Thank you so much. Of course, light is important. Most people don't get enough light, as a matter of fact, and this is why we have a problem with vitamin D insufficiency. And of course, this is attached to other things, apparently bone health, and as well as immunity. And we have our own doctor here on staff at the Climate Emergency Forum. And I'm wondering, Peter, what your thoughts are.
Well, that's a great question, Regina, because clearly our Earth, our Mother Earth, Mother Nature, is in a very, very poor state of health. And of course, the reason is because of one species who thinks it's very smart. And obviously, we're now finding out we're not very smart. So I enjoyed listening to you, Herb, and I enjoyed taking a look at your book, particularly because the big problem, of course, for climate change and dealing with climate change is climate change communication. And I think your book is quite brilliant in, number one, explaining a lot of these scientific terms, which even for me and other people are very, very difficult. It takes a long time to really understand them. So that's really good. But also making new words, which stimulates people, particularly like myself, to think a little bit deeper and harder about the science and the complications of climate change. The scientists have long been the first to recognize that they are not good at climate change communication, which is perfectly understandable. They didn't go into climate science in order to be promoters or communicators. It's very interesting, and one of the probably the things I most admire about James Hansen is that way back I can remember him saying he didn't want to get into communication because he was not a good communicator. But eventually, when things started going bad and nobody really understanding, and also, of course, the denial campaign, which is a terrible, terrible thing, which continues. We should talk about that, what denial means, I guess. But James Hansen made himself, worked hard, made himself into one of the better communicators, for sure, on the science and the truth of global climate change. With respect to communicating the science, we have one unbelievable, incredible problem. And so I'm going to take the opportunity to bring this up. The most important statement ever on climate change science, and probably that means on science as a whole, was made by the sixth assessment of the IPCC. And the statement was made twice by the IPCC then chair Hassan Lee at the big openings of two of the COPs. And the statement is, and I'll quote from the IPCC, without immediate rapid decline in global emissions, we will not achieve a 1.5 degree C limit, nor a 2 degree C limit. Nothing has approached the importance of that statement. The future of humanity, the future of almost all life on Earth, depends on communicating the statement. So I think it completely deplorable that the scientists are not doing this. It has not been mentioned since it was stated by Hassan Lee, and since it was explained in numbers and figures, of course, in the third assessment of the IPCC. So that's non-communication of the worst kind. There's another thing that the IPCC, and of course, I was absolutely delighted that the IPCC, the conservative, climate change body, actually stated this, and more than delighted that it was communicated by the chair. The other thing that the IPCC said several times is that we have to secure a livable future. People need to think about that. I don't think they are. I don't think it's being put out there. Clearly, what it means is it's a very powerful message from the IPCC, and I commend them on that too, which is if we don't put our emissions into immediate and rapid decline, we will not secure a livable future. We will condemn, we will leave a legacy of an unlivable future, and that we are doing. My final word is tipping points, of course, and great thanks to Tim Lenton in particular for sticking with the science of tipping points, because now I think a lot of people understand that, and it's so important. My final word will be on another very important word, which is abrupt climate change. And Paul certainly was the first, and he may be the only person who actually is focusing and explaining what abrupt climate change really, really means, because the scientists misexplain it. There's an example of miscommunication on their just silly, complicated explanation of what abrupt is. So thank you, Paul, for doing that. And thank you, Herb, for an interesting and entertaining, in parts, contribution to climate change communication.
Thank you, Peter.
Yeah, thank you. I really want to second that. One of the things that I've mentioned, and I've mentioned it on this show a few times, is that scientists they're great. They can create wonderful charts. They can talk about varying percentages and all of the things that scientists do. But when it comes to explaining climate change in the way that's compelling and helps people understand the role that it has in their lives and the role that it will have in our world going forward, this has been sorely lacking. So I do absolutely want to thank you so much, Herb, for the breakdown of these various words that really make just understanding climate change so accessible to the regular person. I mean, I love how you right off the bat, you bring up albedo. It's such a fundamental term. And when I first heard it, I was like, I don't know what this means. Maybe I shouldn't even be doing this. I don't know. But it just, washing away that sense of mystery and intimidation that can come with this science terminology, I think is just very empowering for the people who want to know more about climate change, and how they can be part of the conversation, because we need to empower many, many people to be part of the conversation. The last thing we need to do is scare people away with these big words. So I really want to thank you so much for that, Herb.
Thank you. If I could just make a couple of sort of comments. There's so much I want to say, but I'll try to be as succinct as I can. First, part of my goal in doing this, and it was represented by some of what was said earlier now, is to really encourage people, come up with your own words and terms when you see a new phenomena or something that doesn't quite fit. And even more importantly, is come up with your own vision for the future, for your own life, for the life of your family, your community, your neighborhood, your nation. Write something. Where do we want to be in 10 years? How are we going to address? I came up with one possible vision. It's controversial. It relies on cooling technologies that many are still skeptical or afraid of and so forth. There are others. And so the other thing I want to say is, getting back to mentioning Jim Hansen. I mean, Jim Hansen is the one who coined, as far as I know, the term scientific reticence, recognizing that scientists, as you said, Peter, are trained to qualify everything. This may happen. We need more research. And that may be appropriate if we're dealing with 7th century Tibetan pottery, but we're dealing with the future of the planet. We need to be a bit more decisive than that and a bit clearer in our communication, which is a terrible challenge, because we don't want to throw out scientific norms and ethics and ways of living and communicating. And the last thing I want to say is to endorse something I just came across, a communication effort that I think is a good complement to my book. It's by a group called the Potential Energy Coalition. It just came out a couple weeks ago. They did a survey of many tens of thousands of people in every one of the G20 countries. And very briefly, their conclusion was, speak like a human, not like a scientist. So don't talk about 1.5. The single most powerful message that they gave that resonated in every one of those 20 countries, and they were incredibly different, is this term, later is too late. 4 words, later is too late. And just in the last couple of weeks, I've started appending it to the bottom of my emails to people and so forth. And rather than talking about jobs and prosperity and so forth, as important as they are, talk about the future generation. And the last thing I want to say is, and this may be the most challenging, is that if you want to communicate effectively, you as a person or as a movement, you need to basically have a clear, simple message. It needs to be given by people who are trusted by the people who receive the message. And maybe most difficult, it has to be repeated over and over and over and over again. And those of us who live in our minds, we get bored saying the same thing. We come up with new words like I do. And sometimes, like people on the right and so forth, they just hammer those same messages that we think are pointless because people have heard them a million times. But unfortunately or fortunately, that's how people take in these messages. So along with my book, I think I would suggest you look at the Potential Energy Coalition. I thank you so much for having me here today. Anyone, again, who's viewing or listening, I'd be happy to speak with you one-on-one, talk with your group or whatever. Just get in touch with me. Thanks so much.
I just want to reemphasize how important words are. I said words are like arrows. I mean, if you look at some really successful orators and leaders in the world, I mean, Winston Churchill was famous for his use of words and for rallying, an entire population in World War II. And he wrote a good article on the scaffolding of rhetoric he was talking about. And Joseph Romm is an author who wrote a book, from Shakespeare to Madonna, et cetera, about the very powerful ability of words to convey important information. And James Hansen, yeah, he's become, a lot of scientists are self-deprecating, right? He says he's not a good communicator, but he's an excellent communicator now. And I think writing his book, Storms of My Grandchildren, even the title itself is a good phrase, connecting climate now to what our children and grandchildren are going to have to face. And throughout the years, some climate scientists have come up with some really good quotes. Wally Broker is one of my favorites. He was talking about tipping points, which Peter mentioned, and these things called Dansgaard-Oshur oscillations. But his quote is to do with that we're basically poking the Earth with a stick, and we're waking it up from its slumber, its equilibrium state, and we better really watch out because it's can become a monster to us and not basically get its revenge. We're poking it with a stick. I thought that was very good. So I really like the work that you're doing. I really like the idea of you talking about phrases and expressions and words in climate. Really sort of opened up, it hadn't been done before by any books that I'd seen. And I think it's a very good lever to communicate to people that may not know too much about climate change. It'll get them thinking about climate and about possible things that we can do about climate. So thanks again for your book. It's awesome.
Thank you, Paul.
So what I've always been trying to do is to help with climate change communication. The reason was quite simply that many, many years ago, and I've got medical training, I found it quite difficult to understand the climate change science. So that's really how I got involved. After some years, I try to make a rule for myself to try to make the communicating, the words, the ideas, the issues, understandable by a 10-year-old. And I think that's even more important today, particularly because the 10-year-olds are going to have to face this pretty hard to live future. But that helped me to sort of make that a rule, constrained me somewhat. I want to just mention a couple of things that I think might help. In understanding the reports of the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, go to 2 sections on their website. Go to the FAQs. They have an FAQ on every working group report. Now in all of the assessments. They're very easy to understand. They're actually quite brilliant. So go through those. But also go to something that they just started a few years ago, which is called headline statements. And there they zone in on the most important science, and they do explain it in clear words in the headline statements, so that could be useful. I'm always trying to look around for websites and groups. I've come across one quite recently, which I'm really, really impressed by. And it's called Climate Emergency Action. It seems to be all young people. I found it by the very creative, clever shorts that they put on to sort of get the idea about climate emergency out there. They have 2 young people, a young man and a young lady, who do videos explaining the various aspects of the science, and they do a darn good job. So that would be my my little contribution.
I'd just like to add that a lot of peer-reviewed scientific papers now, along with the abstract, which is standard for leading and starting a scientific paper, often papers, not all of them, but more and more of them, they'll have a section next to the abstract, which is the same thing, but without scientific jargon, in everyday language, so that a layperson who couldn't understand a word in the abstract basically can understand what the paper is trying to show based on reading the everyday language version of the abstract. I think journals are realizing that they need to get wider audiences, especially with important scientific research on climate change.
One of the reasons I resonate so much with what you're doing is your name, Climate Emergency Forum, and I don't think it was mentioned, or I didn't mention, one of the things that I take a lot of pleasure in is that, along with a colleague, we were able in 2017 to get our local government, Montgomery County, Maryland, with 1 million people, to declare the first climate emergency in the Western Hemisphere and the second in the world. And today, there are well over 1,000 jurisdictions, nations, states, cities, counties, regions all over the world that have declared emergencies, covering, I think, 20% of the world's population. I'm not suggesting that it's because of us in its entirety, but and we basically went to our local government, laid out the facts, and to their credit, I remember one council member said to me, well, I was expecting a long, heated argument, and he said, well, of course we will do this. Why wouldn't we? Unfortunately, that was all too rare an attitude. But my hat's off to you for recognizing the need, that and never forgetting to put emergency, first, if you will.
I think in the end, what's really important and what's been expressed by you, Herb, and Peter and Paul is, of course, the importance of words. And I love, Herb, that you made up some of your own definitions, much like the Bard, otherwise known as William Shakespeare. So if he could do it, certainly we can. And there's a lot to be said about climate change and a lot of ways in which we need to express it as elegantly and poetically as he was able to do so. So yes, I appreciate that. Let's draw people in, let's include them, let's have an overview of this terminology that doesn't drown people in, I guess I would say, the detritus of science, not to offend the scientists out there in our audience. And with that, I want to thank you. Thank you very much, Herb, for coming on our show today. We will include the link to your book in our description and where they can buy that book. And of course, we all highly recommend that book. For those of you who learned a few terms or want to learn more, go out and get the book. It's really fun reading. Share this video with a friend and subscribe if you haven't, because we want to keep seeing you at each and every climate emergency forum. So many thanks, and we'll see you all next time.